Ben Ferguson, host of The Ben Ferguson Show and author of It's My America Too. And Brent Knudsen is the founder and managing partner of Partnership Capital Growth Advisors. And Republican Representative Darrell Issa of California is here. All right, gentlemen, good to see you guys. Brent, let me start with you. Do we need to differentiate between bigger is better and bigger is something different than merger activity? What do you think?
Yes. I think merging companies that are inefficient is always going to be good. There is a point where merging is just too big, but merging can help get rid of overhead, infrastructure, and bring profit to the bottom line, which is what we need in today's world.
Congressman, bigger, better necessarily?
Generally, a merger, it does drive efficiencies, but I think uniquely when you're looking at regulated entities that have to have firewalls, such as regulated banks versus non-regulated financial institutions, there's a real case for whether those synergies are legitimate or, in fact, because they're prohibited from commingling funds, it works to the detriment of two separate, efficient organizations being formed.
Ben, what about the consumer at the end of the day? I mean, merger activity may work well for the corporations involved, but what about the end user?
Well, I think right now what you're seeing, it's not good for the end user. And I think you look at the financial system that we have right now. The big failed. And the government has been forcing them to get together. So I don't like this right now because I think it's not real and true mergers. When you have the government stepping in, doing what they're doing, they're forcing these companies to come together, and these companies are forcing these partnerships together mainly because they need the government funds or they want them. And I think that is really bad for the consumer. If it's bigger, it's better if it's real and true growth. But what we're seeing right now is only going to hurt the little guy because you're forcing these people to get so big so quickly that smaller companies, I think, are going to be hurt. And that's when, as you know, small businesses are going to be hurt. So right now, this isn't real bigger, better growth, in my opinion.
Congressman, you're shaking your head. You agree or disagree?
I agree with them. If you look at the craziness of Bank of America being told by Merrill Lynch, it's, do it, we'll give you the money, you realize, well, wait a second here. You had organizations which are traders that should not be doing anything but handling transactions. Then you had regulated banks. Then you had these toxic instruments that have been, in some cases, held by these organizations. There was no logical reason to merge these organizations, and yet government intervention saw the logic and ordered it.
I mean, look, Brent, you have to admit, you've seen things like PNC and National City Corp. You've seen things like Wells Fargo purchasing Wachovia. Now, some of these were orchestrated by the U.S. government to make sure that a financial institution didn't fail. Now, do those work, but then others don't?
Sure. I think that there are times when bringing companies like that together are going to get rid of inefficiencies and, again, bring profit to the bottom line and, quite frankly, rationalize industries that are irrational. Use another example, the newspaper industry. I think that there are places today that it needs to be consolidated. Otherwise, the papers will fail. I don't know that's always true in the banks that we're talking about, but I think there's a lot of times that is, and the market will regulate that. If the banks get too big, like Citigroup, I think they'll regulate themselves, and I'm not sure the government should step in to get in the way of that trouble.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
And I think one of the main things here that we're missing, and I think this administration is really missing in Washington right now, is sometimes it's okay for things to fail. And sometimes bigger businesses need to fail for the smaller ones to become big again. And I think that's the biggest problem right now is we've had this mentality that if it is so big and enough people depend on you that you cannot fail.
Yeah,
and the fact is, if you look over history, the bigger they fall, the more that new companies and new technology comes up.
Okay, but here's the problem. I couldn't agree with you more. This is what outrages me most. This is not a Republican or a Democratic issue, but you've got the likes of Ben Bernanke and many different lawmakers, the Treasury Secretary, who are basically saying failure is not an option. So, Congressman, how do we get past that? Because right now, there are all these people who say, wait a second, if Goldman can pay the money, if J.P. Morgan can pay back the money, then it's okay for us to see that some of these companies need further injections, but the U.S. government has basically said, we're back and stopping all of them.
You're absolutely right. And since Hank Paulson's time, which seems like a long time ago to many of us, what you've had is a one-size-fits-all. Here's a Goldman Sachs day trader, as I like to call him, who is making decisions about banks and what's good for banks. He spent his whole career bashing banks and trying to be an alternative. And so all along, we've had this one-size-fits-all for the financial community rather than, as Bill Isaac and other people who knew about banks said, look, treat the bank portion as a bank portion, particularly domestically. Treat these instruments as instruments if they're held domestically. and look at other institutions through their appropriate regulation. We've done just the opposite. We lumped them all together and in some cases forced them to come together.
You know, Brent, I had this conversation with Lawrence Summers when I interviewed him about a week or so ago. We got into a little conversation off camera about Citigroup. And I said, look, this is a bank that is in, what, 170 countries, okay? You look at the regulatory hurdles that Vikram Pandit has to address on a day-to-day basis by addressing financial concerns in all of those different countries. No wonder it's impossible to manage. I mean, you got to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. And then you look at the evolution of Bank of America and Hugh McCall, and he was basically the merger and acquisition megamania man of the 80s. That didn't necessarily put Bank of America in the best of situations.
No, again, I think that's true, and I think we're actually in agreement on this, that there is a place where mergers become inefficient and that the market then can regulate that. I think the market is regulating. You have people like Gary Crittenden from Citibank, for example, who was a big proponent of the original consolidations, who is now running their alternative area and really proponing a breakup of a lot of those areas. And I think our group, for example, is essentially a boutique investment bank that the point just made, we focus on one thing, mergers and acquisitions. We don't focus on banking or other areas, and I think that's true. That's where that matters. But I think, again, there are places where the smaller companies and their innovation creates an opportunity for bigger companies to merge with them.
Yeah, and Ben, look, I mean, what about the retailers? I mean, let's be frank about it. I mean, if you look at the level of bankruptcies that we're seeing, particularly in the high-yield debt markets, it's largely in areas where there's just too many and consolidation is needed.